Hi everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today is another speed paint that I'm looking forward to discussing as we go along here, since it is something I experimented with here and there quite a bit. So I can't wait to get into those experiments and to discuss everything around this image as well. It's something I really have been enjoying as of late, so without much more delay, let's just kind of get to the point, shall we? Now, this is becoming a bit of a pattern. I've recently been dedicating a lot of my spare time to working on another project at the moment, the one with the world building and stories and such. It sort of makes sense that most of my art ideas at the moment are then in relation to that, and they at least have a connection in some form. Yet this one is something that I kind of have to go into a bit of detail for. Naturally, I won't be spoiling anything, but I can talk around the ideas I've been working with at the moment. After all, the scale of this project means I have been considering quite a few aspects of the world as of late. One of them has been various systems of religion, as I've been looking at how they form, how they fade, and, most importantly, how they fit into people's lives across history. Now, this isn't too relevant for this image, other than a few details later on. All of these considerations have been for story aspects, and more practical examples that can be a bit harder to address in a single, still image. I mean, when making a system of belief, it's important to work out the core ideas of it, yes, but also to account for variety and different denominations of a single religion, and, to a degree, how a single person may follow it and believe it, and how it may differ from another. After all, two people from the same religion will interpret the beliefs differently, and there will be slight differences in how they practice, or how they apply it to their everyday. This is mainly why I've been looking at this branch so much as of late. As I have mentioned, I have parts of the world sorted where I can start drafting up some stories to see what I'm missing, or to also find things that accidentally conflict and how I would fix this. In all of them, I kind of realised that the religion branches felt almost flat in comparison to everything else. It was generic with a single set of good and bad for each, when not everything is so simple. Besides, it also made no sense that the world I've made would only have a single system of beliefs. It makes no sense with the scale that everyone would just agree on a single religion and follow it the same way. So it made more sense that there were a few of them that originated in different spaces and kind of promoted different beliefs. As you can probably tell, this is then an area that I have been revisiting as of late, and just to sort of expand it and grow it into something that I prefer to work with, and also something that I can work with on the scale that I need it. It is also a matter of considering why people follow these beliefs, and also what it means for their everyday life, or if it's only relevant on key dates, or not. It's working out how relevant it would be, and also how present it would be in their surroundings and their community and their environment in a way. And going into other branches that I've been reconsidering may count as a slight spoiler at the moment, and it is something that I'm kind of still working out, so don't want to comment on too much. However, this is a really long way of explaining that all of my recent ideas will originate from this unnamed project at the moment. Only because it is mildly consuming my life and free time, but for the better. I've been having fun with it, and before I began this work, I will admit that I had been going through a slight degree of artist block, and I hadn't quite known what to draw off or where to generate my ideas from. And the original sources that I had been working from before just kind of weren't giving me the same appeal that they otherwise had been. But with this, it sort of sparked that creativity once more that I want to explore and continue from. It's given me inspiration and something that I can use as a starting point even, like I did last week, whilst I also have a new sense to experiment as well through all of it, as I have been with the colours. So I hope people are possibly looking forward to this project as well, but I have been enjoying it already at the very least, which is kind of enough for me. I do all of this to have fun after all. However, I feel that I have rambled about that quite enough at the moment. So now to actually look at the image and where the ideas for this one had came from in particular. As I have touched on, it began with the consideration for the religious branches of the world. And I have been looking at it a lot as of late, and I've kind of worked out design details and such from last week too. However, this one had been looking at imagery of them, and subtly tying in parts of what I already knew. I mean, this does tie into something else that I won't mention at the moment, but it meant that I had an idea and a gist for what I would be looking at, and also the themes for this variation of the character's design that had been rather established at this point. Does that mean I have an exact layout in my head going into it? Not quite. I had a vague sense, but I wouldn't have a layout for quite a while. But I had the ideas of the painting and the ties to a divine in some form. I mean, I had to pick which branch and which one I would look at, but it kind of let me expand further on some of the ideas for when I did pick. It meant that I had to look at all the divine figures I've been creating as of late, and kind of develop them a bit further so that I knew which one I would pick, rather than just leaving one and developing a single figure. In the end, I went with this one, who, kind of like I mentioned last week, has ties to the sun and other light-related themes in the world. This is mainly because I have a few ideas for their design, and at the end of the consideration, I felt that I was most excited to work with this one. Being said, I had established what the subject would be, and the painting idea was already dealt with. This meant I could go and look at the layout of it all, and actually kind of get into the core of the idea itself, without thinking so much around the ideas and concepts at this point. So for the idea, I decided on the portrait angle you see here. I knew that much and felt it made sense for it to be in the centre. However, due to the other idea at play here, I knew I wanted it to be a landscape canvas to work on, so it kind of meant that I had to work out the environment for it all. I knew it would be dull or boring to have a single image on a wall, and kind of nothing else, and I knew I would want to experiment. It's how I came to the conclusion that I would use the image as the centre and kind of build up around it. And build up I did. I added everything you see here as I went through various sketches out of trial and error. The curtains were the first secured detail, and then the two side images. I then worked out the greenery and candles while it gradually slotted together into place, and it kind of gradually became the image I knew that I would love. However, it doesn't mean that it was plain sailing in any sense of the term. I had the object placements and had the two paintings to the piece. I also had the main image where I wasn't settled on the figure's pose or how they would appear. And naturally these are very key parts of the image, and I kind of knew that I had to work these out before deciding I would go ahead with this, rather than returning to square one again. And in truth, I got to a point that I was happy with it in sketching, hence why I began the flats in this video. However, I really didn't settle on anything until later in this video. I had that many choices for the main frame and each one changed the impression ever so slightly. I kind of just didn't know which one I would go with. To have her stand up, further back like the other one I did recently, was a little bit too unclear, and it wouldn't have worked out how I had hoped, or how I had planned. It would end up that the portrait was a secondary detail, and it didn't draw the eye quite as much as I wanted it to. To then have them in the middle of what I went with and further back, kind of was semi-better, but it still was a little bit unclear, so I didn't really know which other option I had. This is ultimately why I went with the close-up image, and kind of continued down this avenue, even if some of the details are less clear, like her wings. And the lack of clarity was alright though. It's part of something larger, and it is meant to imply that the world would recognise them, even without these details so obvious. They'd know about the wings, and it would fit into that, as they'd know the stories around them as well. And also in the image there were other identifiables that would mean they'd know this person. So the wings were something that I thought I would work out with these plans, and I'd kind of work with in these phases. It's only later that I considered making this unrelated to the other project, and the wings became an issue again in that respect. I mean, taking away the context of the project that will eventually be shared would mean that these wings are less clear and are partially an issue. There wouldn't be anything to imply them there other than the shapes in the image, as it would be a standalone thing. I then realised as I went that it did work out, and I kind of liked it more with the project. I figure now that I'd mainly been doubting myself as I was nowhere near finished with it all. Yet I had been judging it like I was. I also realised that it wasn't able to be separated from the other project at this point, and if I did decide to do that, the image lost some of its impact and some of the joy I had around it. I had fun with it as it does connect to something larger. I have fun with the fact that it keeps my attention in both areas, and I can explore more with it when it does have that sort of backing. It's why I decided I would share it here as something I'm enjoying. Yes, the context would make more sense if I could talk freely about the project, and really there is nothing stopping me from doing so, yet there is part of me that wants to keep things as a surprise, as it would also pay off better later that way. So yes, the middle image gave me a bit of a headache. That is the main point that I'm trying to make here after all. Though the layout and composition is one of those things where I'm always going back and forth with it anyway, so things like this hardly makes a difference. Also, despite the urge to change it later in the process, I know that I didn't. At one point I covered it and worked around it so that I wouldn't get stuck on the details there, and knew that I could later go back to it. And I am glad that I remembered to try that this time. Keeping it like this matched the visual in my head, and covering it up let me keep both options available without undoing any work and having to redo it later. However, I think I have rambled enough about my ideas and layout and general background to it all. It's taken a bit longer today to get through it all. However, this is where the fun part begins, as now we get to go into the colour palettes, where I had an idea for quite a new experiment here. If you've seen my other videos as of late, you may notice that I am experimenting with gradient maps a lot more, and this one is kind of no different. After all, I had the idea with this one to try using it on only part of the piece in total, and to see if it would look out of place or too strange. To be honest, I have no clue how it would go either, and I hadn't a clue when I began. I just thought of it one evening and saw the sketch sitting there, before deciding that this would be the one I tried it on. It actually worked out really well as well. It looked strange at first, I didn't know how it would be finished off, yet the more I worked on it, and the further I went with it, the more I liked it and could see how it would end up. The layout did help too in this respect. Last week I had the thought for this experiment with the statue idea, and I did consider it for that image for quite a while, before ultimately changing my mind in favour of what I did. It then came back as an idea here, and the portraits made it a bit more approachable. After all, my logic for this one was that if it looked too different, it could also kind of work in my favour for what I was going for here. Paintings aren't always realistic, so it meant that I could look at that, and look at it in that sort of respect. Though in saying all of that, it worked well at the end, but more on that later. For now, I stuck with the grayscale in the paintings, kind of trusting the process with it, and decided to surround it as I did with the colours. After all, I knew I wanted a darker colour on the wall, and the brown worked well to tie into everything else. It kind of kept the warmth that I was going for with everything. Yet the other colours were then tied to the figure's theme, and then the blue as a complement to it all and something a bit different to give it a bit of range. As I have kind of touched on, the figure ties into the sun. They connect to yellow primarily, as it is the first colour assigned to them. Yet the orange is then sort of a secondary colour that overlaps with other parts of the religion at times. This is why the candles are these colours. The red flowers then complement this element of the ties, and it is kind of in the same palette and family or theme, if that makes sense. And as I've said, the main reason for the blue is to complement it, and to kind of tie it into the green from the plants as well, just so nothing there is too out of place. Now though, let's get into the details with this piece, which is always the best part of the drawing. The details are how it comes together, and they're the bits that finish everything up in interesting ways. So let's just get into the first one. And the first detail here is a bit of a short one. It won't take me much time to talk about it, but it is the figure's halo. After all, if you saw last week, it will be familiar through the person, and though the person is slightly different. That is because, as I said in that one, the halo had been a trial run for this character, and I included it there as that one was an earlier draft in the process for this one. By that I mean that the character in that one was originally going to be a version of this one before I changed my mind on it. However, for this image, it also has a similar theme. The diamonds spaced out are meant to resemble sunbeams, and the tying to the diamond symbol actually ties into the world and the religion. The circular shape of the halo and form is then another nod to the sun, which ties it all into light. It's why I designed it for this character in particular out of all of them. I also included it as, without the context of anything else, it still furthers the idea that this is a painting of someone who matters. See, more than anything, I wanted the person to read as important. It was kind of the entire point to the image, and as said, the world would definitely know who this figure is. The halo is part of the world in another sense as well. Yes. I mean, the world will be fantasy, so I can get away with a fair amount. Yet the thought process was also similar to the image with the statue, as that had been an earlier variation of this. The halo in this is like the sun, a nod to the element, yet also draws inspiration from imagery of saints, as a way to kind of denote it as someone important. The other figures in relation to this one do differ slightly. They have their own identifiable traits, so it again is why I added the points to the ring, rather than keeping it as just the simple sun. And I also added the sun motifs to other parts of her as well. It's mainly through shapes I would associate with the sun, or marks I used to draw the sun with when not shading it, or when I'm not making it out of light in a piece. The main example of this is the curves on the neckline, where those bumps are usually how I would draw a simple sun, or kind of like an icon of a sun in a sort of basic format. It was actually one of the few spaces on this figure that I had the space for detail in this appearance of her, though it still worked well in my favour. It looks like a portrait with enough detail to not be boring or plain, but not too much that it would be overcrowded or too busy at the end of it. And that had kind of been the main balance for this one. It isn't meant to be my most detailed piece I've ever done. The simplicity has an appeal to it which works in my favour this time, and it kind of lets everything slot together. I mean, I couldn't have the person overly detailed or the surrounding environment plain or empty in comparison. It's why the pair of paintings were added. They add a little bit of detail and a little bit more to the environment and piece, and it kind of gives it a sense beyond just the simple portrait on its own. More on that pair in a moment though. For now, I want to address the final detail of the person though. It is a part that I've alluded to at this point as it gave me a lot of disagreements in the entire thing. See, the wings are part of the character I can't exactly remove for world building reasons. To remove them is a lot of work elsewhere. There are some allowances to a lot, but this is something that I kind of can't change without a lot of hassle, so removing them was out of the picture. However, as I have mentioned, they gave me some trouble in the early phases with the layout. When it came to colouring and detailing them, I thought I was past that phase and had settled on what is seen here, and in the end I do get to a point where I am happy to continue with this route. But I did stop working on their details to either change them, alter them, and maybe change the pose entirely at one point, since I wasn't quite happy at that stage. I know I've discussed most of this element, but from a detail perspective, it is slightly different. I mean, it is meant to look as if one wing is wrapping around in front of her, rather than it being a simple and still portrait with them both in the back. The wings this way would have more presence, and it would resemble the idea I had a bit more. Otherwise, I found that the wings were unclear, or became a secondary detail that I frequently lost sight of under the person and the hair, when in reality it is quite a key component of identifying them. It's why I kept the front bit. Yes, it may not have been the clearest, but again, it is working off the basis that this is part of something else. The wings were a challenge in most angles, and the pose is something I argued with a lot. I considered at one point changing the rotation of the portrait even, so that the portrait itself in the centre was landscape, and it would allow it to feature the figure with space for more wing details. Naturally, I didn't go down that route. I kept with it and pushed through shading them. I did this with the knowledge that I could change it after the fact. If I shaded them and still hated them, I could make that change with very little issue. There would be nothing stopping me, and I could look at other options in that stage too. I mean, I could always redraw it even if I still wasn't happy. But I lost nothing but time by giving it a go and continuing this route before dismissing it. And in the end, I am kind of glad that I stuck with it. This is what I thought of originally, and I did like the pose of it quite a lot. My main issue had actually been the shading process for it. I kind of continuously forgot how wings and feathers would work, or how they would look, so I kept trying to do something with it that didn't work, or wouldn't look right even if I did finish it. Once I looked at the sketch again, I sort of remembered how I intended for it to look and work, and I could actually go back to working on that to achieve it, rather than trying to shade the end of the wing like the base of the wings. In saying that though, the wings are something that I adore the visuals of, yet I rarely get a chance to draw or include them in an idea. The ideas I used to generate would often mean that they didn't fit, or that they would come to throw off parts of the composition whenever I tried to include them in that way. There are many ideas that began with wings that came to gradually lose them as the idea developed. I suppose that is another reason I'm enjoying working on this project at the moment. It encourages me to draw things that I otherwise wouldn't get to or wouldn't think of, and in cases like this, I have a reason to keep them rather than trying to fit them into ideas that are just stronger without. Now, in the shading phase, I loved the wings once I remembered how they were meant to look. It became a detail to that area that furthered the idea I was working with, and it completed the space with a bit of interest rather than mirroring the person like I otherwise would have at this stage. Yet that is all I can say about the main figure in the centre of the painting. So let's look at the background of this one instead, shall we? This is a motif taken from another sketch of this person. As I touched on in my first gradient experiment, I had first draft sketches of each figure that was in a similar vein to that one that I chose to use for the practice. They had the elements in the background like that one did, so I sort of repurposed that element to a degree in this one. The design had naturally changed anyway, so this way I could keep it relevant in a sense as well. This is really why I added the sun to the background, and decided to keep it as the only thing in the background. There wasn't space for anything more in the piece, but it also tied nicely again into the motifs and themes that I had been drawing from when building this idea. I could then add further details to the rays and use that to connect this being further towards their element. It was something simple, and it filled the space whilst also allowing me to add more marks to the rays for interest, like I did before as well. I did add some shadows around the halo for this detail too. It was mainly to make these two elements stand apart from each other, whilst still remaining coherent enough that they are part of the same image, and I didn't need to make one darker or change them. They are very similar in value, so it was only natural that I had to do something like this. The only final part of the character had then been adding colour to them via overlays that helped add tones to the figure and sort of planned out some colours for the character as I wanted, and these were all under the final gradients. These aren't final in her design either, hence why I kept it to overlays under the final gradients, but it did help add more interest to them, and sort of wrap this character up and finalise how they were in this image. As for the gradients themselves, I kept it to a lot of yellows and brighter tones. I used the same approach as the other one, where I used a mixture of multiply layers and add layers. It's only right at the end of the entire drawing that I decided to use a gradient over the entire thing as well, rather than keeping it to just the bits in the frame. And doing this approach was really because it finalised the entire image, and it solidified the approach and impression that I wanted. It also made the overall image darker, yes, but I was able to alter it so that it wasn't overtaking or too much for everything, and it all wrapped into an outcome that I can enjoy, and the darkness was partially intended anyway. Now, away from that, I did have two other paintings to work out the layout for. These are things I can't explain as much, but there isn't too much to them in comparison to the main one either. They were more spaces that I could include different nods towards other themes of the world, or kind of look at different visuals that would associate to the main painting. It's why I went with the circle and the diamond in the end. Out of the two, I would rather talk about the clouds and the diamonds, so that is what I will be doing here. The diamond, as I have admitted, is part of the world building and ties quite a lot into the entire religion that is in this format, or at least ties into this branch of it all. It is also something that I'm still working out exactly, as I kind of want to look at ways to make it more unique, and I also want to consider how it would be displayed if I kept it the same at this moment. It was also meant to resemble ideas of the sun as well in this painting. Clouds and such are supposed to help it resemble the rising sun, and it was a detail that was subtle and it didn't take much work to include, but it kind of worked out really well in the end. These two smaller paintings really took the gradient maps quite well as well. They looked amazing under them, and there were so many times that I came to love how they were looking. There were actually quite a few times that I tried something and loved it, before trying something else and loving that as well. I think in the end I could have used about 5 different routes on it, and it definitely showed me what gradient maps could do if I took this approach, and maybe considered trying something more like this in the future. Most importantly though, it was fun in those sections. There wasn't too much to ramble about, but the colours really came together there and they were so vibrant at many points that it looked really nice. They were also the parts that I'd tried the gradients in whilst the main bulk of the image was still in progress, and that was to sort of gauge how it may have looked before completing it. That I have touched on, but it really was fun to see how vibrant the colours could be and how it would come together, even if it did get covered by the shadows near the end. Now, finally, before we wrap up, I want to quickly touch on the flowers and the candles present. I mentioned in the development phase that they were added to appear like offerings and decoration for the scene. They were also there to complete the environment to a degree, but they're the finishing touches from the sketch that brought it all together to kind of sell the right impression that I wanted. After all, it kind of furthers the idea that this is something or someone important and respected if they're left all this stuff. The flowers grow, but not too wildly, as if it is being kept neat and maintained by someone else within the world. The flowers then are vibrant and in bloom, actively alive and thriving again like someone is there to look after them. At the base there is the greenery indoors, as if it's been placed there on purpose. And yes, they have very little ties to plants. It's not quite their main association and specialty, yet it overlaps as a form of an offering and there is a subtle link there. They're alive, they grow, and between them all are the colour-coordinated candles to match with them, and to kind of match with the theme of the divinity as a nod to their element. The yellow and the orange tie into it as if it's left by people and push the idea again that someone is here to care for it. It's not forgotten or abandoned, and it is actively visited or used for a purpose or another. They may be harder to see at the end behind the shadows, yet they are visible and do pop a slight amount in the dark. They're bright where it would be otherwise hidden. All of this then is to further the importance of the painting. The shadows around it make it look late, again relating to the second and unmentioned tie. Yet even beyond all of that, it's present and easy to see that people do care for it. It's not dusty, not scratched or damaged. It's been looked after, and people are still actively leaving gifts to it. I mean, originally the candles would have been dripping, yet I decided it looked strange when shading, and it fit better where the candles were newer. In this one they've recently been lit, and they're fresh, compared to something that may have been left to burn for a longer length. In this one the older ones have been cleaned up and removed instead of being left there. The flowers are then by the same logic. It's an alive plant and it hasn't withered or died. It looks as if the old ones have been removed and replaced with something newer. The newer ones are blooming and it's showing life that has a nod towards the element. These details did let me consider how people in the world would practice or show their faith as well, so it had been really fun to include and wrap it all together in this respect. Besides, this environment did let me develop the practices and look at what would be left there and to who and for what reason and why. See, a lot of it let me ask certain questions. Questions like, why would they favour flowers and candles as offerings? And why would the colours differ between the same figure? Perhaps the flowers hold one meaning, and the candles hold another. It also let me work around questions such as where this world would be, and where this would be located. Perhaps a place of worship, or would it be something that fits in a home? Maybe it could be both. And finally, before we wrap up here, it lets me look at including animation into illustrations again, which is something I've kind of stopped doing as of late, but do want to get back into. The detail is entirely off camera, yet I decided to animate the flames of the candles once I finished everything else. Is it the best? No, not really, not by a long shot. Yet it was fun, and a smaller introduction to do it before I start looking at something larger, or I start thinking of harder projects to approach that would at least put the skills to a test. For now, it's a simple flicker either way, and that's only a few seconds long. Yet it's building that confidence to start approaching more things and to start considering how it could fit into projects and pieces either subtly or as a main feature. Who knows? Maybe next time I will try them with lights moving or a curtain swaying. Perhaps I'll add motion in 2 areas rather than 1, or something like that. For now, who is to say where the limit is? Though that is all we have time for here. I know I've waffled quite a bit this week, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway. I promise that the project will be shared in more detail soon enough, and these may make a little bit more sense to you when they do. For now, I otherwise hope you don't mind these drawings from it, as it is a sort of early teaser, and it is giving me a lot more motivation for art at the moment, and kind of experimenting as I've already touched on. Being said, I will try to do something new next week and look at some other ideas that I've had as of late. But for now, have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.